Greetings lads and lasses, Lumar here, and in today's video we are going to be looking at Marvel's What If animated TV show released on Disney Plus in 2021. In this video we'll be looking at the premise of it, what inspired it, and how the animated series unfortunately decided to rush some of the ideas and stories presented in the first season, especially towards the season finale. So for a start, what is What If? What If focuses on the idea of what would have happened in the MCU if a slight change occurred in the storyline compared to what we have seen in the movies and TV shows. For instance, what if the Avengers didn't stop Ultron from uploading his consciousness into the Vision body? Or what if Hope Van Dyne had been a SHIELD agent instead of working for her father Hank Pym? Or if Peggy Carter had gotten the super soldier serum instead of Steve Rogers? Now this itself is inspired by the Marvel Comics issues of the same name, the What If issues. Now these issues are exactly the same in principle as the show, with writers going back to a popular comic or storyline and changing one aspect of it and writing what would happen because of this change. For instance, what would happen if Flash Thompson got bitten by the radioactive spider instead of Peter Parker? Or what if Doctor Doom became the Thing? Or what if the explosion on Sakaar that would kill the Hulk's wife and child and lead to the World War Hulk storyline, what if the explosion killed him instead? Now, the comics themselves didn't last very long. It was usually just one or two issues that focused on the storyline and then it was just left. Which brings us to the TV show. While most of the stories are self-contained, showing the consequences of a single change and finishing on reasonable endings, the way the TV show is made poses several problems, such as what those endings are, the differences in terms of changes, and of course, being self-contained. Let's move on to the first problem. For a start, the premise isn't accurate. Many of these stories aren't the consequences of one single altered change. The most notable example of this problem is in episode 7 and 8. In episode 7 we're told that because Odin never adopted Loki, Thor was never forced to compete against him for responsibility as king, meaning he was even less honourable by the time of the Thor movie, focusing on partying instead of being a good warrior and leader. Except for the fact that the personalities of several other individuals in the MCU are also changed, seemingly at random. Nebula is the adopted daughter of a galactic warmonger who went about slaughtering half the population of each planet he came across, and made her and his other children suffer through grueling tasks and missions, and punishing and torturing them when they failed, with Nebula becoming a bitter, jealous and resentful woman who failed him the most out of all of his children. Yet here she is, just attending a party on Earth without a care in the world. The Grandmaster is a tyrannical ruler of a gladiatorial pirate planet, who constantly uses force, manipulation and bartering to enslave as many people and objects that interest him. And in this episode, despite being surrounded by several powerful individuals, weapons, ships and other technology, the only thing he takes is a goddamn go-kart. Surtur is a being whose entire role and personality is devoted to the destruction of Asgard. That's it. He doesn't have anything else besides that in his life. But here he's somehow convinced to abandon all of that and party. It just doesn't make any sense, especially in comparison to what the choice in this universe was. If they wanted to have their funny episode, then they should have tried harder to remain consistent with both the MCU proper and the show's own premise. Another example is in episode 8, and we're told that the single change in this universe is that the Avengers didn't manage to steal the Vision body Ultron was making. Ultron, now in the Vision body, would proceed to wipe out the entire world, kill Thanos, and then take the stones, killing all life in the universe. Except that isn't the only change needed for the event of this story to make any sense. For a start, Thanos arrives on Earth in 2015 with the 5 other stones, meaning he enacted his plan a lot sooner than he did before. Then there's the scene where Ultron kills the Guardians of the Galaxy, as they're in the same location where they're fighting the big monster at the start of Guardians of the Galaxy 2. Except Guardians of the Galaxy 2 takes place in 2014, while Age of Ultron takes place in 2015. Speaking of this Guardian scene, Gamora is here, but if that's the case, then how did Thanos get the Soul Stone? Gamora was the only one who knew where it was, and if she's free, then he wouldn't know how to find it. Then there's the fact that this would mean that someone else, presumably Nebula, died to get it, which is another change. Finally, the last change needed for this story to work is what happened to Xandar. Now, in the original MCU, Thanos led an attack on Xandar to get the Power Stone, destroying the Nova Corp and getting presumably half of the population killed. But here, Xandar is in full fighting shape when defending against Ultron, which begs the question of how Thanos got the stone in the first place. The second problem I have is that some of these stories feel like they're only half developed, and because of that, the endings aren't very satisfying. It feels like there could be other stuff they could have done with the story before they ended it. Now, my problem with them never reaching a satisfying conclusion by the end of the story doesn't mean that I dislike it because it ends on an open ending. For example, at the end of episode 3, yes, it closes the main plot about who's assassinating the Avengers, but it leaves a open but satisfying tease about Nick Fury leading a revolution against Loki. Would it be nice to see this story continued? Yeah, I think it's an interesting premise. But if it didn't get continued, we wouldn't feel cheated or disappointed. The same with episode 5. The heroes, after suffering heavy casualties, managed to escape with a potential cure for the zombie virus in hand, but with the implication that Wakanda has or will fall before they arrive, meaning it'll be a very hard fight to get everyone cured and fight off zombie Thanos. Would it be nice to see it continued? Yes. But if it didn't continue, I would just assume the heroes continued to fight for survival against the armies of the zombified Thanos. But the same cannot be said for every episode. Again, in episode 7, after Thor gets everyone to fix all the damage around the world, the story just sort of rushes Thor and Jane together as a couple, despite the complete lack of build-up. And then it ends the main story. There's no real climax or conclusion to it, it just sort of fizzles out for the Ultron stuff to take over. Now, one thing I have to think about is the tone of what the episode was doing, and the episode itself doesn't suffer from this too badly because the episode was designed to be a one-off comedic, non-serious episode. So if the ending didn't end in the most satisfying way possible, then it doesn't really matter that much because of the tone. But I still think it shows that they didn't really have much of a story here besides Thor is a frat boy, and then they just kept going with it anyways despite the lack of ideas that would lead to a satisfying conclusion. Remember how I was talking about tone? Well, that same comedic tone from episode 7 cannot apply to episode 6, the King Killmonger episode. Throughout the episode, we see Killmonger betray those that stand in the way of his goals. He climbs to the top, he starts a conflict between Wakanda and the US, they have a small conflict, and then as they start to begin a fully fledged war with each other, the episode just kinda stops. The episode seems entirely focused on just being a build-up episode without having any sort of central conflict to it. And because of that, the climax isn't as impactful. We don't even get a proper ending to this storyline when it reappears in episode 9. The war has already occurred off screen, Wakanda is somehow defeated despite their advanced technology, and Shuri and Pepper are on their way to arrest Killmonger. And even this small segment of an ending doesn't end properly because the Watcher takes Killmonger out and he's never returned to this universe to face justice. The story fizzles out, and then the next time we see it, it's just to tell us that this story isn't going to get a satisfying conclusion. And it's just a shame because most of these stories have definitive or a open enough ending that is satisfying or at least conclusive. But these two just don't offer enough in terms of character development or storylines to be able to end on a satisfying note. And now we reach the third reason why I think this series is rushed. Because it rushed the Crisis crossover event. Now, as we all know, a satisfying build-up can make a climax all the more thrilling. For instance, it took 10 years from the start of Iron Man 1 to Infinity War and Endgame, but by the time we got there, it was worth it. We had a large amount of well-developed and complex characters, plenty of world building, interesting stories and themes. So when we see one of the biggest events in comic history come to the big screen in this universe, seeing the different climaxes and character send-offs, most people love these movies. Even Endgame, that had a lot of problems with the plot, was at least one of the better movies when it came to emotional investment. So imagine, for instance, that at the end of Phase 1, instead of getting the first Avengers movie, the next two movies were Infinity War and Endgame. That's what it feels like watching the first season of What If. We see all these independent stories playing out over the season, all these different variants and worlds created by the simple premise of what if, and then at the end of the 7th episode, all of a sudden it turns into a multiverse destroying MCU crossover event that needs all of these different stories to merge together to fight it. Now, there's several reasons that doing this is not only nonsensical, it's most importantly rushed. For a start, the only way that this fight is going to be satisfying is if the characters involved are people we can root for, or at least have an interest in. Except this fight is taking place in the first season, so the only characters that they can draw from are the first season. The only main characters that aren't involved in this fight are from episodes 3 and 5. All the other characters from all the other episodes are brought alongside to fight this multiversal god. That's right, instead of going around to the different universes, finding the strongest beings in all of the multiverse, the Watcher instead chooses to go for people like a genetically enhanced woman with a shield, a mortal man with a jetpack and some plasma guns, a genetically enhanced man in a catsuit, a mortal woman with a sword, a Thor that hasn't reached his Ragnarok level power or has the Stormbreaker axe, and in fact would be much weaker than Thor originally was because he chose to be a partying frat bro instead of honing his skills as a warrior. The only person the Watcher recruits that makes any sense is a version of Doctor Strange that got so powerful he accidentally destroyed his own universe. Apart from him, none of the other applicants make any sense from a logical perspective. If you're going to get a Star-Lord, why not get a Peter Quill version that has his celestial powers? Why not get a Infinity War era Thor, someone powerful enough to take on Thanos with the Infinity Stones? Why not just get a bunch of ultra powerful Doctor Stranges on your team? In this episode, we see that Strange Supreme is a big enough deal to be a thorn in Infinity Ultron's side. I'm sure 5 or 6 of him would completely annihilate Infinity Ultron. And what's even more stupid about this is that in the previous episode, the Watcher decided to fight against Infinity Ultron himself. Yet in the final episode, he doesn't do anything except assemble the team, and then he just watches the fight happen instead of helping. The Watcher and Strange Supreme could easily have taken on Infinity Ultron. Of course, this isn't going to happen because the creative team is only going to choose people that have appeared in previous episodes, and so they don't have enough of a character roster to be able to choose some more powerful candidates. And so in a incident that could destroy every universe in the multiverse, the Watcher decides to do the idiotic decision of hiring mortal humans to fight it because there's not enough familiar faces who are powerful enough to root for. Now, I say that, except they still decided to bring in a version of Gamora who's never been established before. Which brings us to another problem that these final 2 episodes bring to the season, which is the fact that this crossover event means that the other stories had to be cut short and suffer because they wanted this big climactic finish. Now, as mentioned before, the King Killmonger storyline could have been a 2-parter. One part showing his rise to power and the start of the war, while the other part of the story would see the major events in the war and the fall of Killmonger thanks to Pepper and Shuri. The animation team even went out their way to make this war-torn Wakanda because of the war. But because the Watcher needs to recruit this version of Killmonger, we never see this second part. He just gets plucked out of his universe and then he never makes it back in time to finish his story. The same story problem happens in episodes 2 and 3. Episode 2 ends with the premise that Star-Lord will have to fight Ego and possibly Peter Quill, while episode 3 ends with the idea that Nick Fury, Captain America and Captain Marvel will be leading a resistance against Loki and Asgard. However, the story that continues episode 2 never gets finished, and the story that continues episode 3 mostly gets skipped over, and then finishes when the Watcher leaves Black Widow in this universe, who then proceeds to take out Loki. But this is nothing. As I mentioned, there's a version of Gamora that appears in the finale that has never been seen before, and she's quickly whisked away to fight Infinity Ultron. The reason why this happened is that, because of budget and time constraints, they didn't have time to finish all the episodes. So instead of finishing this episode, which would establish her story and her character, they just decided to add her into the climax episode while giving the audience no clue as to who she is, why she's important, or why we should root for her. Imagine that there wasn't the Nick Fury credit scene in Infinity War, and that the Captain Marvel film didn't get created before Endgame came out. So during Endgame, there's just this random invincible woman who came out of nowhere to fix the plot. Can you imagine how baffling it would be for Endgame to be Captain Marvel's introduction without any foreshadowing? That's what this feels like. Gamora just randomly appears because they chose to do the Avengers movie before finishing the solo origin film. And now we have the final problem. When you have a piece of media, it's important not to rush through certain events too quickly because you can end up running out of ideas, or you can make an event that makes any other event that takes place after it seem inconsequential in comparison. For instance, we have the Avengers movies. We have the first film, which focuses on the invasion of New York, which can lead to the enslavement of humanity. In the second film, we have several conflicts happening all over the world, leading to the possible destruction of Earth. And then the third and fourth Avengers films, which deals with Thanos' attempt to wipe out half of life in the universe, and how the Avengers attempt to rectify that. The story of each Avengers film begins to escalate, leading to a big climactic fourth film. So, now that we've had Infinity Ultron, a inconceivable threat that was going to destroy the multiverse and needed the Watcher to break his oath in order to stop him, where do we go from here? It's the first season of What If, and we've already had a storyline that involves the possible destruction of all of creation. So how can we ever have a storyline of this magnitude mean anything when we've already seen it? Don't get me wrong, they can still do good work and stories in the later seasons, but in terms of a threat that needs an ensemble group to be made up from across the multiverse, they've already done it. So if they do it again, then it's not going to be as impressive, because they've already rushed through it in the first season. So overall, I feel like the first season of the show is incredibly rushed because many of the stories needed obvious refinement, and that they were in such a hurry to have some sort of big climactic showdown that not only did they contradict the main aspect of the show, that it's about a bunch of individual stories, but they've done it in a way that no other big bad will be able to surpass what we've already seen. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm still interested in seeing what Season 2 will bring, but yeah, I feel like they've kind of already shot themselves in the foot with the initial first season. And judging by how everything else in Marvel's been going so far, I don't think the writing team will be able to rectify this problem. But yeah, thank you for listening to my video. I hope you've enjoyed it and I've explained my points clearly and concisely. Maybe I even managed to change the minds of a couple of people watching this video. But yeah, so thank you for making it to the end of the video. And I hope you have a great day. Please consider liking and subscribing. And I hopefully will see you in the next video.